Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by Simon Schuster Australia. Back in 2022, I was lucky enough to attend the launch party for Julie Bennett's debut novel, The Understudy, and since have marvelled at the way this woman has taken to author life like a duck to water, if I could use that well-worn analogy. Storytelling is in Julie's blood, and that first novel was the most magnificent story, taking readers back to Sydney in 1973, inspired by her own childhood as the daughter of an opera singer, as well as the Sydney Opera House itself. But today, Julie is back on the podcast to talk about her brand new novel, The Lost Letters of Rose Carey, published by Simon Schuster Australia earlier this year. Another glimpse into yesteryear, The Lost Letters of Rose Carey is a page-turning, immersive and fascinating story, a triumph of a novel inspired by a trailblazing Australian woman. And I'm absolutely delighted to have the chance to speak with Julie about her brand new novel. Congratulations, Julie, and welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
How does it feel to be the author of these two incredibly well-received books?
Oh, thank you. I think it's a little bit like when you have your babies, you incubate them for a period of time and you dream about them and you wish the best for them. And then suddenly they're here and it's all so exciting to see them suddenly come into being. It's a wonderful experience and I'm very lucky.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Now, The Understudy was a straight historical, and yet Lost Letters of Rose Carey is a novel that flips between the past and the present, well, specifically the 1920s and the present. But I think, Julie, the absolute highlights of both these books is the glimpse into bygone eras, and you've done such an incredible job of immersing readers into the past. So I'd love to know, when you began thinking about writing novels, were you always interested in Australian history and showcasing it through your work, or was this more happenstance?
Well, when I wrote The Understudy, I didn't actually think of it as historical because I'd been alive at the time. So my publisher said, well, Julie, it's 50 years ago. So that's a definition of historic. And of course, it does flip back also to the 1950s. So yes, I guess it is pure historical fiction, but I didn't really consider it as such with that novel. Of course, this novel is definitely 1920s, so also definitely historic, but as you say, has a modern day timeline as well. But all of that said, I always loved historical fiction as a young woman growing up, and I was into the Gothic novels. I loved Victoria Holt. I loved Catherine Gaskin. I loved historic novels. I felt like I was entering into those worlds and it was magic to me.
Gosh, Victoria Holt, I haven't heard that name in
know.
so long. I loved her books too.
Me too.
That's hilarious. So now The Understudy was obviously a novel really close to your heart. It was based on your own childhood experiences as well as drawing on your father's experiences as an opera singer. But I wondered if you could tell us what got you started thinking about Rose Carey's story.
Well, I really love the performing arts, and I guess because of my family background, and I love that when you enter a stage, you just go into that world and the world around you ceases to exist. So you just exist purely on the stage. And when it came to writing my second novel, I knew that I wanted to have the heroine from a performing artist point of view. So I sort of thought about what other kinds of performing artists there are. And I thought, well, a stage actress is quite like an operatic singer. So the experience of being on the stage, I imagine, would be quite similar. And I wanted to explore something new, a new performing art that I hadn't actually had much experience of, because I do like to teach myself new things as I write. And so the next obvious conclusion for me was film. And then I started to wonder, well, what sorts of things had Australian women been doing in film in the in those very early days? And actually what I discovered was that they were very involved in experimental film from the late 1890s, I think it was, to the early 1920s and onwards. They were very much experimenting with film. So Lottie Lyle and Raymond Longford, and there's a Premier Award still named after them. So Lottie was writing and directing and producing and starring in her own sort of film in the early days. And then there was the McDonough sisters who also created their own films. And there was three of them doing all those different roles. And then there was a woman called Louise Lovely, who was also a Hollywood movie star, like Annette. So these wonderful women had been very, very much involved in early film. And I thought, well, then Annette came to me, and Annette was just so amazing. She was so talented. She was such a diverse actress, and she had done other things apart from acting, which made her extremely interesting to me. She was a champion swimmer, and she attempted the English Channel, and then she went on after her film career. She went on to promote health and fitness for women, and I just thought, wow, here's a real inspiration for my character for my next novel. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So you mentioned Annette Kellerman as being an inspiration for your story, and she indeed was an incredibly fascinating woman. And in fact, I think I mentioned this to you once before, Julie, that to my shame, I didn't really know very much about her before reading this book. But she was for a while one of the most famous women in the world, wasn't she?
Oh, she certainly was. And, people have come to me and said, well, was she really that big a deal? And yeah, I think she really was. I heard someone describe her as the Lady Gaga of her times. And I think maybe that's going a little too far, because I think Lady Gaga, she's pretty out there, and it was sort of more conservative, if you like. But she was certainly a big deal. And she was in England, and she was in America, and a household name, for a lot of different reasons. And when she came back to Australia, people would go and meet her boat. Thousands of people would go down to the wharf to meet her boat and interview her, and, just see her. She was a genuine hot star. Yeah.
So, what was it about Annette's life in particular that you felt like you wanted to explore in this novel?
She reminded me a lot of my grandmothers, for her, what would have been called in those days their daring do. They just got on with stuff. They were just so matter of fact, and so, well, we've got a job to do. We need to get stuck in and do it. And in that way, quite brave and quite fearless. I think Annette was more brave and more fearless than my grandmother's, but she gave it a go. She was always willing to give things a go. And I also came across the fact that Annette, she didn't let the facts get in the way of her story. So
Mm.
sometimes she massaged the truth and really self-promoted, to the extreme. And at first I thought that was a little bit, I wasn't really across that. But then as I explored her life more and the things that she did, I realized that she was living in a time in which women were not as, let's say, free as they are today. So she was really pushing boundaries. She was really trying to make her way forward, and she helped in that way. She helped inspire other women, and that's a fantastic, fantastic thing to have done.
Yeah, you mentioned that she was pushing boundaries. And there is one story in particular that comes to mind, and that's in relation to the swimsuit. I was wondering if you might like talk
Yeah.
about that a little bit.
Yeah, so she variously claimed to have invented the modern swimsuit for women. I think that's a bit of a stretch. I think there were versions of swimsuits that women were wearing, and certainly she had worn a man's bathing suit, which is sort of the trunk, it had a top and it had trunks. Then she was going to, I think she was actually performing her high diving for royalty, and they were all aghast that she was going to show her naked legs. So she sewed leggings into this costume, and she was certainly wearing that. But I mean, what I think I give her a lot of credit for was she popularized a modern swimsuit. And she said things like, well, woolen swimsuits for women are a very bad idea, and you actually risk your life if you try and swim in these swimsuits, because they're heavy, and wool gets compounded with the water and can pull you down and make you drown. So she certainly popularized it, and there was a swimsuit range named after her called the Cullinan suit. And there's examples of that still available for purchase, a little outside my price range. But yeah, and she had a bit of a fashion wardrobe around that as well. She had matching capes, and she had, parasols and so forth. So it was quite a line of swimsuits. And so that was a good step forward for women as well. Yeah.
Indeed, it was. As luck would have it, when The Lost Letters of Rose Carey was released, we attended the screening of a film called The Original Mermaid, a biopic about Annette Kellerman's life. And watching that made me understand how truly extraordinary she was for a woman of her time. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how the screening of that movie came to be at your launch.
Oh, so the publisher actually organised that for me, which is amazing. The film is a short film, really. I think it's less than an hour, and it just shows a timeline of the sorts of things that she did. And if you ever get the opportunity, I think you can view it online now. Do have a quick look, because it showcases what she did on the stage, what she did in the pool, some of the things she claims to have done. So she claims to have been arrested on a Boston beach, and there's actually people I've talked to who are more knowledgeable than me about Annette say, well, we can't really see much evidence of this, but hey, it was great PR to say she was arrested for being in this swimsuit on a Boston beach. So it sort of puts into a fun chronology. I think the movie was really fun about her life and times, and I think makes her much more accessible, if you like, to the modern day audience. So if you get a chance, absolutely go find it. Original Mermaid. I think it's Ronin Films.
Okay, so I think we've talked around the story, but can you tell us more about The Lost Letters of Rose Carey?
I kind of talk about it as being a mystery history. So I love historical fiction, but I also love a good mystery. So I try to wed those two things together as I did in the Understudy. And what happens is it opens in modern day, and Emma Quinn, who finds she's filming a documentary up in the beautiful Carrington Hotel in the Blue Mountains in Katoomba. If you ever get the opportunity to go and stay there, do. It's marvelous, marvelous old hotel. And Emma is going through IVF with her wife, and when the book opens, she's waiting for a phone call or a text message to tell her whether the latest round of IVF has been successful. And as she goes to lunch, she discovers, unfortunately, it hasn't. And she's very distressed about this, mostly because she's really in love with her wife, and she really wants to make her wife happy. And so she doesn't know how she's going to deal with her wife's pain again, and she doesn't know if she has the kind of resilience and strength to carry her wife through another trauma. And she goes for a walk through the Carrington. She comes across a storeroom, and in the storeroom is a box of memorabilia, and in the box are things relating to Rose Carey. So there's these canisters of old film, there's newspaper clippings and photographs, an old camera, and then there's this stack of letters that are no envelopes, they're just tied up in a blue ribbon. And as the novel progresses and Emma goes through this sort of painful period in her life with her wife, she sort of rations these letters out and reads them one by one. And as she reads them, she begins to understand that somebody is really suffering and is begging for forgiveness for something that's happened. And it's just slowly revealed over the course of the novels. And she rations herself sort of letter by letter, which also helps when you have 40 chapters to write. But there's also the parallel narrative, and that's in the 1920s itself. And that's where Rose is in Australia. She's been filming in New Zealand with her very close group of friends and colleagues. And she's come back from New Zealand, and all we know is that there's been some sort of incident in New Zealand. And she discovers that not only is she unexpectedly on the brink of bankruptcy, but she begins to suspect that somebody wants it in for her and wants to end, if not her livelihood, her life. So that's the central mystery. Who is it who's after her, and what the hell is going on?
Yeah, history mystery. I absolutely love that term. I want to get to the contemporary timeline in a second, but I wondered, because as you say, Rose Carey was inspired by Annette's life, but
Yes.
Rose most definitely wasn't Annette. So I wondered, in the writing of it, how do you manage the line between fact and fiction when you're writing a book which is inspired by a real life person?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So I think certainly Rose is inspired by Annette, and certainly a few of the things that happened to Rose were similar to things that had happened to Annette. But what I wanted to capture was Annette's, as I said before, her daring do, her pluck, her courage, her inspirational way of living her life, getting on with life and not letting things get her down or pull her back or stop her. So I wanted the essence of that character, the essence of that woman to inspire my woman, because I think Annette was a superwoman. But what I wanted to convey was you don't have to be, a superwoman to be a super person, that you can take this essence of courage and inspire your own life, be your own inspiration for your own life. So when you traverse the narrative between things that happened to a real person and things that you want to happen with your character, what I do is I like to have those sorts of events that contribute to some of the drama. But really, it's the way that Rose deals with them, the way that Rose thinks. And of course, when you're talking a fiction, as opposed to even a biographical fiction, or a biography based on someone's life, what you're doing is you can create your own dramas because I don't think that Annette was actually ever had a life in danger in the way that Rose does. So it's about being able to create a fictional story that's been inspired by someone who has that courage, who has that character. That's how I do it.
Yeah, fantastic. And so at any point do you find that difficult? Is it a difficult line for you to walk?
Oh, look, sometimes it is because you want your character to be their own person. And so sometimes you think, well, it has to be enough of my own person and to be real to the events that play out. But what I do is I research and research and research and research until I feel like I know enough about this era, these events, this person, to set that to one side and to start to dream. It's about dreaming about who the next person is. And of course, you keep the flavor of the person that you researched, because that is what you've been doing. You've been living in their life. It also means you don't have to be 100% correct on things that happened. You don't have to say this is what happened to Annette, because it's not Annette's story. It's actually Rose's story. So, it is sometimes, but I just try to leave the research alone and see how that character presents herself to me. It seems to be okay.
Rose's story and indeed Annette's story do make women today truly appreciate that life wasn't always the way it is now for women. And while we still face challenges in modern society, Rose's story certainly did highlight how women like her, being independent, unmarried, and wealthy, could easily become targets for hate and gossip, don't you think?
Mhm. Oh, absolutely. And I think that's a parallel with today. And if we look at social media and the impact of even a tiny bit of celebrity status on your social media, you have to tread a very fine line. You have to be careful, but not too careful, because you still want, speaking as an author trying to promote work, you want to share enough of yourself so that people understand who you are and understand what you write. But you can't share too much because, you still need to have a personal and private life. But I have seen examples where people have, come greatly undone by social media. And it's all about, we seem to be experiencing a stage in life where people find it easy to detract from others and to attack others and troll others. And it's the most unkind treatment of people. You would not treat people like that in real life. You wouldn't speak to them like that. You wouldn't call them out on stuff in such an aggressive manner. And it's quite confronting. And I think Rose and Annette had to deal with that kind of thing, but perhaps actually to a lesser extent than we have to today, because every woman or every person on social media exposes themselves to that kind of reception, and that's not great. It's not great.
So, Julie, I want to talk about the contemporary timeline now, if we may. As you said before, the novel opens at the historic Carrington Hotel in Katoomba, which is an actual place. I wondered if you could tell us more about the hotel and your decision to set part of the story in this place.
I love the Carrington Hotel. It's what I would call sympathetically restored to its era. And the reason that I love it is because, for example, you can stay in a traditional room, which I insisted we did. And in a traditional room at the Carrington, your bathroom is your own bathroom, but it's the end of a hall. And so in the middle of the night, you walk this wide carpeted hall and the old floorboards creak. And if a writer, I don't know any writer that doesn't love that bit of atmosphere. An absolutely beautiful old building, and I loved it. But I actually, as a newly young married woman, lived at the base of the Blue Mountains in Emu Plains, and we used to spend a lot of time in the Blue Mountains. So I felt like in that way I was coming back to it, experiencing it again. And then there was the serendipitous, or maybe not quite, fact that Lottie Lyle spent time in the Blue Mountains because she suffered from TB. She was recuperating the Blue Mountains, and Lottie was too unwell to star in her own movie. So she decided that she was bored trying to recuperate. So she wrote scripts for a movie that was called The Blue Mountains Mystery. And part of it was filmed in the Carrington Hotel. So I just love the fact that there was that connection with early film at the Carrington Hotel. So that's why I decided to use it. Yeah.
Fantastic. So did you spend a lot of time there?
I just spent overnight there, I think, when I was researching. But as I say, I'd had some experience in the Blue Mountains. I think I lived in Emu Place for about 8 or 9 years and, was a frequent visitor. So I felt like I knew the area quite well. And, certainly had been on walks out to the Three Sisters and all that sort of thing that you do. So it was a matter of recapturing that familiarity, and it's lovely. And then, of course, when the book was out, we had a book talk at Springwood Library, and I stayed in the Carrington again with some friends, and we may have sat around the fire and eaten and drunk red wine and really enjoyed it in winter, which is also a beautiful time to spend in the Blue Mountains. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of has inspired me. I mean, I have spent some time up in the Blue Mountains. I think my husband and I stayed at the Hydro Majestic.
Yes, it's beautiful too.
Yeah,
Very beautiful.
overlooking the Jamison Valley. Is there anything better?
Yes, gorgeous, gorgeous.
Emma Quinn, as you said earlier, she's the woman who finds the box of letters that belong to Rose Carey. And she's a videographer. And as you said, she's having a tough time in her personal life when we meet her. And delving into Rose's letters really give her something to focus on other than her own life, doesn't it?
She's trying to navigate the difficulties that are going on in her own life. And I think she uses the letters as a little bit of an escape. And what I'd hope to do through those letters is try to show that it doesn't really matter what time period. I think my personal belief is it doesn't really matter what time period you're in. Life will always be difficult. There will always be challenges. We all have to have our crosses to bear. And what I wanted the letters to show was that you can walk through those. You can walk through those. And this is what these women did back in 1920s. And this is what Emma and her wife Lauren can do in the future.
You touched on it a little bit earlier that Emma and Lauren are going through IVF. I think it's fair to say that Emma, certainly when we meet her, isn't entirely sure she wants to become a parent. And this was causing some conflict with her wife, Lauren. I wondered if you could give us some insight, Julie, into why this was something you wanted to explore in this novel.
It's so interesting because I never start with an agenda I'm not setting out to highlight issues in particular, but of course life is full of issues and full of problems and full of challenges. So what happened with Emma was she just sat down beside me and told me her story. I didn't have to think too much about her story. And this sometimes happened. It happened to me with the Understudy, my first novel, with the character of Margaret. But Margaret was a very different character. She was yelling at me. Whereas Emma just sat down beside me and she just said, it was like someone saying to me, can I just tell you what's going on for me at the moment? And that's honestly how Emma came to me. And I just told her story. And it was the least difficult, shall we say, part of the novel. It really was. And I didn't have any preconceived idea about telling the tricky story of IVF. It just happened.
One of the strengths of your novels, Julie, is the way you write about sex and relationships more broadly. I think this is such a skill, and I'm always left in awe of the way in which you balance these elements of your story with other threads. So I wondered if you could talk us through this aspect of your storytelling and how you decide how much is enough and the level of detail that you provide.
I guess recently I've been a little bit surprised about people wanting to, I mean, it's a valid question, but wanting to discuss that, because for me, I want to give my characters a great love life. I want them to have a great love life. And I feel like, well, sex is clearly a part of a great love life. And so I find it really interesting that people think that that's a thing to navigate. I just want my characters to be as kind of real, if you like. I mean, I know that everyone doesn't have this experience the same love life, but I want to give them a good love life because that's part of being, a happy human. And then when it comes to how much is enough, that is quite a tricky question, because what is fine for you might not be fine for another reader, and it does depend a bit on who my audience is. And what I try to do when I navigate it is I don't really like to talk about body parts. I like it to be subtle. I like it to be more about the emotional aspect of it, more. And of course there's the physical desire, but desire and love and the beauty of it rather than the graphic side of it. But that said, some people, think my book is a bit graphic, and I'm quite puzzled by that, because I just think it's a normal part of life and love. So I try to be as true to the character or characters, obviously, in those scenes as I can be.
Do you think it's about the history? Do you think it's that people, when they're picking up an historical novel, aren't expecting that?
I do. I do think it's about history, and I think sometimes that's why I've sort of taken to calling my books mystery histories, because I think people might pick up the book and think, because it's historical fiction, that those sorts of scenes aren't in it. And I find that a little bit puzzling also, because lots of great historical fiction books have sex in it, or are talking about the romantic relationship between couples. But I do think perhaps some of my audience think it's going to be maybe a chaste romance, I don't know, or just pure historical. So it is, and that's me learning about my audience as well. But, the other thing is that I guess, you could always modify what you write in line with who your traditional reader is. But I don't want to do that, because I feel like it doesn't honor my characters or my stories. So I think it's going to be the way it's going to be.
Yeah. And let me reiterate, this is an absolute strength of your storytelling. So from my point of view, I loved it. I love having that really nuanced and also very real exploration of relationships, in both the historical and the contemporary threads, in fact.
They might be experiencing slightly better love lives than some people. I don't know. Maybe that's what it is. I'm not sure.
Let's go back to the historical thread for a moment, because in addition to the Carrington Hotel, which you've made reference to in the book, there is also reference to some other iconic Sydney landmarks. Yeah. The Sydney Town Hall being one of them, the Tivoli Theatre, and another one which I was completely blown over by was the California Chocolate Shop on Pitt Street, which I'd never heard about before.
Oh, yes. I know you write as well, Claudine. So, you delve into things, you research, and then you find a little gem like the chocolate shop. I found on Trove, I found a postcard, and it was for the chocolate shop. And I went, well, it has to go in, just has to go in. And yeah, so it's a little bit of the joy of discovery.
Absolutely. Now, I love historical books and historical timelines in novels. I love going back in time and getting a glimpse, particularly of what Sydney used to look like. So I wondered, Julie, how did you go about fleshing out the Sydney of the 1920s?
So in the understudy, I was very much focused on the Sydney Opera House, which had just opened, and Macquarie Street. And my characters walked up and down Macquarie Street in Sydney. I love Macquarie Street. And so I felt like when it came to researching Rose, a lot of what had been in Macquarie Street in the 1970s had also been there in the 1920s. So it was, I felt like I knew Sydney, that part of Sydney anyway, quite well. And it was a joy of rediscovery. One of the places I found was the Astor Apartments in Macquarie Street, which is one of our first company title apartment buildings. And it opened a little bit late for me to include in the novel, because it opened in October 1923. But it had this fabulous, it was like a building that was full of these eclectic bunch of people, quite wealthy, obviously, but, artists and women, a lot of women, single women on their own. And at the top, there was still is, the building still exists, a garden. And from that rooftop garden, the residents could oversee the coming together of the Harbour Bridge. So, I sort of just carried on what I felt like was my romantic attachment to Macquarie Street, and just took it back a bit to the 1920s. And I read a wonderful book on a history of the Astor Apartments, written by Dr. Jan Roberts. And she had included things like day-to-day caretakers' activities in 1923 in the Astor. And that gave me such an insight into what was going on, because, you can look at photographs and you can read articles and you can read biographies, but this is a journal, or like an account of what actually this caretaker was doing on a day in 1923, opened the back door to the blah, blah. It's just an absolute gold for me that these are the comings and goings on a day in 1923. And it just opened a window for me. It was amazing.
So tell me about the town hall at this time.
Well, I'm very much in love with Sydney. So
Can't tell.
And I know it's incredibly biased of me, but I just think it's the most beautiful city in the world. There's no other city for me anyway that comes anywhere near it, because we have such gorgeous weather, we have such beautiful harbour, we have such wonderful buildings. And so, of course, in the Understudy, the building that I was in love with and still am was the Sydney Opera House. But I was thinking, well, what's in 1923 would have been a building with the same sort of kudos, if you like. And although it had opened a long time before, the Sydney Town Hall was a very special building and also absolutely gorgeous. And I was lucky enough to get the assistant curator walk me through the building and tell me stories about it. And I could see, it's a public building, so you're allowed to go in at any time. But I was able to see things, through her eyes, and to hear stories that had helped shape the hall to be what it is today. And it's absolutely stunning building, absolutely stunning. And I thought, how can I not put this in the book? I have to. It's gorgeous. You have to wait a few chapters before you can see the town hall in the book. But yeah, it's an absolutely gorgeous building, and I loved it. And I love writing about Sydney landscapes and buildings and architecture and so forth.
Was there anything else in your research that surprised you?
I think we're always surprised by the things we unearth. The scale and the magnitude of the performing arts communities in those early times, is quite an eye-opener. Because if you think about the logistics of moving, I mean, these companies that put films together, there were hundreds of people working on the films, sometimes thousands of people. And we're talking about an age where the motor car was a relatively recent invention. So they're lugging this stuff, just the logistics of moving stuff around, like it's not giving away too much to say there's what they called in those days a crystal tank in which the Rose performs. It's an aquarium, really, a huge aquarium full of water. And it's like 15,000 gallons of water or something was in this tank, and the water had to be heated to a certain temperature. So to, uncover stuff like that, and it's just a marvel that people were able to organize the logistics for things like that when, they didn't have access to things like great big semi-trailers or flatbed trucks or whatever. I found it absolutely fascinating.
Julie, if there was one thing that you would like readers to take away from your novel, what would it be?
On that note, I think I would love people to fall in love with Sydney, to experience it through the eyes of my characters. It's a wonderful thing to be permitted to do in a lifetime, is share your love of something with an audience. And I would love for them to fall in love with Sydney the way I fell in love with Sydney. It wasn't my birth town, but it sure is my home. And other areas in Australia, it's really important to value what we have here. And it's very beautiful.
You will know that there are a lot of writers who listen to this podcast. And given that you are now 2 books in, possibly with a third one that you might be working on, I wondered if you had any tips that you could offer to writers out there looking either to get published or to finish their manuscripts. What kind of advice can you offer us?
I think the very first thing you need to think is, do you actually really, really want to? Because if you really, really want to, you really, really will. But if you're kind of not that into it, but you think it would be a great thing to do, but you're not really, it's a very demanding profession, especially if you write historical fiction, because you've got a lot of research to do. And you've got to be able to, get that in your head and be able to then translate it into a scene or into a character. And it's time consuming and difficult. It's also quite lonely. So this is the very social part of the job, is promoting the book once it's out. But the path to get here is long, even if you've been accepted. You work hard on it. And, I did lots and lots of drafts. And it's lonely because it's only you. And then when you do get your editor, then of course you're working more collaboratively and you're working together on it. But the actual meat of it, you do pretty much alone. And it can be so lonely. And you go through imposter syndrome every minute of every day. And getting over that, it's a psychological barrier. There's lots of times, especially with the first book, where I said, this is hard. It's almost too hard. But if you really want to, you should just keep doing it. Put your backside on the seat and get it done. And that's the only way you're going to do it. You're going to have to sit down and do it. Otherwise, it's just going to be a dream that you never realized.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. That's wonderful, wonderful advice. Well, Julie, it has been such a joy and a pleasure to talk to you about The Lost Letters of Rose Carey. I absolutely adored this book. I loved learning about Annette's life and historic Sydney. Congratulations once again, and thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Oh, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to chat with you, Claudine. Thank you.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.